Okay, all right, let's get started with things. So, good evening, everyone. My name is Neeraj. I will be in conversation today with Srikar Raghavan. Welcome to this live session. So, before we get things off, a little bit about what we do and then about our author who we are in conversation with today. So, Karwaan was founded in 2019 as a students run collective by Ishan, founder, and the idea behind Karwaan was to make to make history public and more accessible to the masses in general, right? That was to inspire them to, be more inquisitive and committed to the field and, help them to develop a deeper understanding and appreciation of the past. So, as an independent run collective, we are, working towards breaking stereotypes of academic disciplines and trying to, bridge the gap between the academia and the masses. Karwan has, been featured by the likes of Time Magazine, The Hindu, and we've gotten good reviews everywhere. And we've had the honor of featuring intellectuals like Romila Thapar, Irfan Habib, Harbans Mukhya, and of course, like legends like Shashi Tharoor and so on. So, with that being said, coming to a speaker for today, I am honored to be interviewing Srikar Raghavan today, who is an independent researcher and writer who's currently in Bangalore.
No, I'm
And
in Mysore.
okay, okay. Yeah, sorry about that too, because you often get mixed up. Like you talk about how you were a Mysore born, Bangalore bred, right?
It's
Mysore
yeah,
bred, Bangalore born. Yeah. Yeah. So Shikhar has done his MA in English at the Manipal Center for Humanities, and he was awarded the New India, and he had a fellowship from the New India Foundation. And as a culmination of that is his incredible work, Rama, Bhima, Soma, which is, of course, a genre-defying work, but it at the heart of it is, it is a politico-cultural exploration of the landscape of the late 70s and the 80s, and it's a quite a remarkable work to say the least. So, with that being said, let's get into the heart of the discussion.
thank
Hello,
you,
Shikhar. Good evening.
Neeraj. Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks a lot for that very uh, generous, nice introduction. I hope I'm
Yeah,
audible.
yeah, you are audible. So,
Okay.
with that being said, my first question is, at a more, just to try and get an understanding of where you're coming from. You say that you are a Mysore bred, Bangalore born, and you emphasize that you wrote this book in a sojourn when you were in South Canada. So, how exactly did these three different environments contribute to the shaping of your narrative? That is one part of my question. And the other part of my question being that, the title of the book itself, Rama, Bhima, Soma, and in your introduction, you talk about it being like, a metaphor for democracy and how at different points of time, different groups managed to seize power or managed to gain control of the narrative. So what exactly was it that, led to you trying to, come to a connection between these two things? Because it's not something that, someone would, try to join the dots to. So yeah.
Um, well, Mysore is where I grew up, right? So since like fourth standard, I've been in Mysore. I did my engineering here. Not exactly the most pleasant memories, but it was a formative sort of uh, time for me. And so the game Rama Bhima Soma is known by this name in this region, Mysore, Bangalore also to some extent, but elsewhere it's known by a bunch of different names, and in fact it's played across the country through all sorts of different variations and all of that. And so I mean I wrote about where I wrote the book because it just it was only that kind of a small town atmosphere that allowed me to get into the process of writing a book like this. It's sitting and reading for long hours and hundreds of pages in a novel. You need some kind of a quiet retreat kind of scene to so I would keep moving from like Bangalore to Mysore, go to Bangalore, go to all these bookshops on Church Street, pick up some interesting stuff, and then cart it all back to Manipal. And so that sort of formed a nice triangle for me. But coming back to Rama, Bhima, Soma, so it's a ball game we used to play in school. You might have played it as well. People who are listening might have played it as well. All you need is a ball. You chuck the ball high in the air, and then someone does it, and then you wait for it to fall down. And each of the three pitches are counted off as Rama, Bhima, Soma. And after that, whoever is closest to the ball picks the ball, and then you're basically bashing each other, trying to, you know, inflict maximum damage and so on. It's a very uh, violent game, but we had a great time. And so there is something inherently democratic about that metaphor, because power is always changing between the self and the other. You're identifying not just with yourself, but also with the rest of the mass, and power is temporary. And if you get close to someone, you can't, if you touch them, they can't attack you. And I mean, there's a range of endless metaphors that come out of this game. It's an endless, infinite, ruleless game. And it is, I thought it was a nice demonstration of this sort of native wisdom of everyone gets their turn, no matter how uh, messed up it might be in practice. At least there's this ideal that somehow we as kids seem to recognize intuitively, and maybe there can be some hope in it. So it was a nice way to frame this whole moment in Karnataka that I'm talking about, just the
Uh,
70s and
and I
80s
think
and so on.
somewhere
Yeah.
you mentioned as well about, how games are, reflective of the societies that they emerge from. And I think you use Squid Games also somewhere as an
I mean, Squid Game
example,
is a
if
very
I'm not
direct
wrong.
metaphor for uh, the, the death cult of capitalism that is happening right now, right? Where you have a small minority is basically, you know, acquired so much of wealth, and then you have this almost lottery where people are trying to find a foothold in the system of greater and greater inequality. And games themselves, anthropologists have always found it really interesting because it tells you something very fundamental about what a society values. And I think there was some essay by Ram Guha where he talks about football in West Bengal and Kerala. Why is it that football is more, you know, popular in these left-dominated states? Something to do with this notion of collective
Collectiveness.
spirit and so on. So they're always very interesting springboards to understand how societies function and what people feel about competition and collaboration and all of this.
All right, that would bring me to my next question. And what I found fascinating is how your book sort of explored, the lives of different icons in the Kannada literary world. And during, like, when I used to listen to people like, say, Sugata Srinivasaraju, whom I have a lot of respect for, he, used to talk quite a lot about such figures. And then when I met him one day in person, I, asked him why he hadn't chosen to make that a topic of one of his writings, say, but he didn't seem too sure whether such a kind of work would appeal to, say, a lay audience or a larger audience. So what is it that made you feel that, it would be something that would catch the audience eye, or the eye of the audience, and, resonate with them more?
Well, one thing is that I'm the generation after Sugata. So Sugata, he's grown up amidst all of this. So in some sense, it is already a part of it. He's thought about, and he uh, so maybe needed a new sort of sense of innocence and discovery to sort of extract these parts, and maybe that's what I'm bringing to the table. But more than the uh, looking at the audience and then writing kind of approach, I think what drove me was more of a personal uh, curiosity and inquiry into. So, like you said, these aren't things that have been written about in great detail, certainly not in English. And so once I started reading Kannada, and I realized that there's so much here that I hadn't encountered before because I was just not in this world trying to learn more about it. And So I came from the perspective of an outsider who was trying to become an insider. And so this, I think, gave it a unique flavor of excavation and discovery. Okay, what happened half a decade, I mean, half a century ago, and trying to figure out how these connect to debates and ideas and very fierce, animosities that we seem to have in our contemporary political climate. And so it was a personal thing, but I think there was this idea that if it is interesting me as an outsider, then it's likely to interest other readers who are just like me, trying to find new interesting stories about our past. So uh, that was what drove me, I think, trying to find things that would interest me and then guessing that it might for someone else in a similar position.
Yeah. Okay, so that brings me to my next question. Like I mentioned before, this book, it defies the kind of classification under a single genre. And even although it stays more around the 70s and 80s, you there's often a lot of flip-flopping, and we tend to go back all the way back even to the 9th or 10th century, even to the current present day kind of scenario. But then that sort of brings me, like, during this, like, the period that you tend to cover, there's such richness and such amazingness in detail, and we witness the kind of vibrancy of Kannada literature that I myself wasn't too aware of, to be honest. I mean, sure, I read Kannada in high school, and I came across these names like, say, TP Kailasam, and I had read his Tollugatti when I was in school, but
Oh, okay.
I didn't quite think too much of it. I'm like, okay, what is this story? It feels too childish at a level. And then, I saw the deeper symbolism when I read your chapter on it. So that, sort of brings me to my question. When you have icons like, say, Shivram Karant, Kuempu, TP Kailasam, Prasanna, Basavalingappa, and Sidlingaya, and like all those figures that you cover, why is it that, like even you point this out, how come, like, where does this, kind of historical amnesia kind of show up in today's this thing? Because I don't think there are, that many people who are, say, well aware of, this period of a Kannada Renaissance, or, the kind of literary developments that was happening in the Kannada world at this time. Like, people would say, if you ask them about a period of, when Kannada was doing well, or when Kannada literature was great, they would, harken back to some kind of a ancient era rather, like, go back to, say, a Basavanna, or even if you ask, bring them forward to the 20th century, maybe they would, like, just throw in the name of Kuempu or a Bendre or so on. But beyond that, there isn't much that people are aware of. So why is that, in your opinion?
I mean, I think every generation experiences their own kind of amnesia, their own, relationship with history. For instance, in the 70s, I met a lot of Dalit activists who, when they first saw Kuempu live in the flesh, they thought this is crazy, because they thought he's some long gone legend. How is he still alive, and this sort of stuff. So every generation has their own form of amnesia, and there are new ways to discover this past and so on. But you're right, there is something about this contemporary crisis of Kannada, in the sense, more of an emphasis on English, and there's these new anxieties that what is the role of Kannada in the contemporary world. And so all of these, and of course the attention span, social media, and all of this, these are new problems. But I don't think it's fundamentally different from any earlier generation that was also trying to grapple with its own past. And so you rightfully said, so if you look at all of these figures, Tipi Kailasam, Siddlingaya, they all have to be understood for their historical moment. You can't understand Kailasam without looking at him in the context of nationalism and the freedom struggle, and the kind of the critique of colonialism that is so important for those writers. You can't understand Siddlingaya without understanding or situating him within the subaltern movements of the 70s onwards, and sort of the anger and the 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 disappointment with elite echelons of literature and so on. So all of these writers, you have to see them for who they were and what they were responding to in their own times, and that is really the challenge of historicizing them, and because that's the only way that allows you actual sympathy and allows you to engage with their art in interesting ways.
Yeah. So since we, briefly touched upon Siddlingaya, I would like to come to another figure whom you also dive into, the career of this rather remarkable individual called Basavalingappa, who is, this remarkable Dalit politician who, emerges around the time when Devaraj is in power. So, there's this whole thing wherein, he's a statement that he makes is, quoted out of context, wherein, he compares Kannada literature to Busa, that is cow fodder. And, that leads to a whole kind of, political outrage. And then, you have a whole wave of oppression against Dalits as well. And you have, you have a kind of Dalit awakening also that takes place at the same time, given everything that is happening. So how exactly do you situate the Busa movement within, the current developments in Karnataka politics, and what is it that it managed to, like, maybe our audience itself isn't too well aware. Could you, elaborate a bit more on what it managed to accomplish, in the state of Karnataka?
Well, I mean, uh, in the entire decade of the 1970s, there's probably no other single political controversy that proved to be so much of a tipping point and a talking point and inflection point. So the for readers who don't know, so this is 1973. This is just after Karnataka has been actually renamed Karnataka. It used to be Mysore State. And Basavalingappa had been quite active in this process of getting Karnataka renamed and so on. So he's coming out of this environment. And so there's this Ambedkarite conference happening in Mysore, and a lawyer named Sanjeevaya, he starts speaking in English, and audience members say, no, you have to speak in Kannada and so on, but he continues to speak in English. And then Basavalingappa later takes the stage and he defends this choice. And he says, all Kannada literature is busa, so cow fodder, not good, unnutritious, boring. And so this proves to be such a provocative statement. Newspapers are covering it. There's protests on the streets. Dalits are being attacked. People are being accosted in colleges, and they're wiping vibhutis on their heads. So it becomes a very uh, a religious caste politics inflected event. And not just in Karnataka, Kushwant Singh picks up on this. He writes an editorial saying it's not just Kannada, there's Busa in all literatures. And a lot of prominent Kannada writers, from Kuempu to Anantmurthy, they respond positively to this, and they say they urge their readers to try to think deeper about why Basavalingappa would say such a thing. And so this is, I mean, if you had to draw a timeline on things that lead up to what is known as the Dalit Bandaya movement, this would be the first landmark in the 1970s. After this, there's movement, there are collectives, writers collectives, artist collectives, some of them with direct, impetus given by Basavalingappa himself. So it sets off in motion an extraordinary chain of events. And Basavalingappa himself is still remembered today. A lot of the interviews I had, people reflected on him. They remembered him as a bold and maverick leader who faced a lot of criticism. He had to undergo political setbacks also. I think after this, Devraj just drops him from the cabinet. It's too much optics. So he he uh, he exemplifies that moment in Karnataka politics quite vividly and uncannily.
Yeah. So, I mean, but what I also meant was, do you
Mm.
see it as do you see a kind of long-lasting effect in terms of what it managed to accomplish? Sure. I mean, writers like Sidlingaya and Devnur Mahadeva emerged out of this very milieu. But do you see it as, a brief, flicker before, sort of fading out? Or do you still see the kind of impact in today's landscape? Because I personally do not see a, very strong Dalit movement in contemporary Karnataka politics.
Well, I mean, more than me, there are writers in Kannada who have actually been talking about all of this. So I let them speak in my book when I asked them to reflect on that moment, and a whole bunch of perspectives came in. But all of them were trying to again emphasize that you had to see the activities of the DSS as being extraordinary for its own time. So I have a long interview with the poet and activist Kodiganalli Ramaya, where he has these wonderful recollections of what it meant to be part of the Dalit Sangharsh Samiti during those times, where songs would be traveling at the speed of light. They're marching from village to village, but the songs have already traveled. Drunk villagers in the middle of the night are able to, shout the same slogans as they are. And so there is this deep subordinate consciousness that was so palpable, and so they remember that period as being full of life and energy, and calling truth to power. And of course, there you can always have a pessimistic view of things that happened 40, 50 years ago, or everything peters down in the end. I mean, uh, you can't have the same kind of social movement going on for decades and decades. Things change, ideas change, times change, and they they become different things. So this conversation we're having right now is part of whatever events that all of that set in motion. So, um, I mean, it uh, had great effect immediately on politics and culture, the 80s, 70s, the 90s. And then you're right, there is this sort of fragmentation, which is also a theme of the book, whether all of these movements, whether it is the um, uh, environmentalists, the socialists, the farmers' movement, there is this broader narrative of disintegration, personal animosities, kind of disillusionment with ideas that really didn't pan out the way people would have expected, and that is also uh, true at the same time. So it's uh, it's a way of looking at the past and then trying to see how these fragments feed into our own fragmented moralities today. And that's one interesting way to look at it, I think. But I'm sure you had a different question in mind.
No, no, no. That's sort of, like covered what I had in mind. And
Okay.
so, yeah, my next this thing, like this is based on another conversation that I myself had. Like when I was once in conversation with Professor Rama, who was a reputed writer in his own right. We were, just discussing different such literary figures, and one such name that, popped up was, this figure called S.L. Bhairappa.
Hmm.
And then, at one point, what we discussed about was, like he mentioned, when Bhairappa keeps his politics out of his writing,
Hmm.
Bhairappa, the writer, then shines at that moment.
Yeah.
But, that sort of put a deeper question in my head. Like, is it possible to separate or and look at the writer in isolation from his politics? I mean, you studied a lot of such literary figures in your book itself. So, do you see the practicality of such an argument? Because Bhairappa is almost like the kind he holds a kind of status within the Kannada literary world. Like like to give an analogy to the audience, it's almost like the kind like say an Amish Tripathi holds in the current Indian
No,
discourse.
I think he's far more interesting than Amish Tripathi and far more worth reading. except maybe one or two novels, Avarna and so on, where it is just in your face. But apart from that, Bhairappa is, I found him uh, very intriguing, and especially when you juxtapose him with Anantmurthy, who was his sort of big
Nemesis.
rival, and they were both. I mean, I write it uh, saying there were two brothers fighting for the attention of the mother in some sense, uh, joined the battle from different sides. But uh, I, so, I find Bhairappa to be a far more prolific, creative writer with an exceptional talent for fictional world building. And the hyper realist sort of writer, one common theme across his literary work is like this landscape of hell, which is how I see it. So Bhairappa grows up in a very poverty-stricken environment, early 20th century. He was orphaned. I think his father left them early. His mother dies in a plague epidemic, as do some of his siblings, I believe. And he writes about all this movingly in one of his autobiography, Vitti.
Bitti.
And so this theme of orphanhood itself is something that keeps rippling through his work, and there's this sense of tragedy and doom, and there's very little scope for humor in this landscape. And of course, Avarana, his most controversial novel, is also the novel I like the least. I couldn't possibly complete it
I
also.
read it
It's just,
sometime in 12th or so. I didn't think too much about it that time, but in hindsight, I'm like, oh my God, what had he written?
yeah. So clearly, very, very over the top and in your face, and sort of biting, uh, acidic sarcasm, and using characters in a novel as sort of ad hominem arguments to justify particular ideology. I mean, this is what the novel is supposed to shun. It is, in some sense, the anti-novel. Uh, and a lot of Kannada writers across the spectrum have critiqued this. And but even in the Kannada sphere, with some of his fiercest critics, they understood that this could be separated. For instance, Gauri Lankesh, who vehemently critiqued Avarna after Bhairappa's novel on the Ramayana, Uttarakhand, I think, which is
Hmm.
about Sita
Sita's
and
perspective.
Sita's perspective from the Ramayana from Sita's perspective. She applauded it wholeheartedly, and so if you're sensible, you read the book and then you judge it. And uh, so I don't like these generalizations about writers. Okay, he's a right-wing writer. He's a that achieves nothing. The that's an intellectual cop out. I think it's more fruitful to read them, know their richness, critique them where you find serious disagreements, and see their relationships with other writers, with their own personal life, and that way you actually get an insight into what is happening behind the making of this literature that has a certain ideology, and how you can uh, understand it better. I think that's a more mature way to go about things.
Yeah, that was a good take. And with that, we'll move on to the next part, and like we will discuss the Marga and Desi aspect that you covered in your book. And it was one of my favorite parts. It's like fascinating how you managed to link so many distinct threads to, this one common tradition. And at one point you mentioned how a figure like Dr. Rajkumar, he represents the culmination of what Sri Vijaya envisioned of a single cosmopolitan Kannada when he wrote his Kaviraja Margam, in the 10th century.
Hmm.
Could you elaborate a bit more on what you meant by that?
So that's a quote from Anantmurthy. So Anantmurthy once said, so the Sri Vijaya's Kaviraja Margam is the first, I think the first extant Kannada text, certainly the first text that deals with poetics and grammar and, trying to very self-consciously create this new kind of vernacularized elite language. So he takes inspiration from Sanskrit poetics, but he's trying to uh, formulate a new Desi Kannada literary, discourse. And so Anantmurthy says that throughout history there have been attempts to make one language prevail over a whole land. So the Kaviraj Margam says the land we know as Karnataka is that between the Kaveri and the Godavari, and the people here have rich poetic tastes and all this sort of stuff. But he says it was only actually achieved in the 20th century when Dr. Rajkumar speaks in Kannada, which is when you actually have an entire population listening to the same inflection, the same language, and appreciating it as a region. And so this battle between the Marga and the Desi, which again goes back all these centuries, the words have been used. And it's not just in Kannada; it's across regional languages. In Marathi, it's the Margi and the Deshi, same thing. Everyone has this vocabulary of this battle between the local and the cosmopolitan or the universal, and it's not a battle that's going to end sometime. It's always going to be there. You always have this tension between the local and the universal culture. It's never going to vanish. It's just up to us how we relate to this and how we understand this friction. And this is a friction that in some sense generates culture. You can't have culture without this dynamic clash of different paradigms, because a lot of uh, culture is created exactly through this kind of opposition. Say, look, I understand, I see you, but I'm not going to be that. I'm going to be different. I'm going to do it slightly differently. And this is the part of the Desi history that scholar D.R. Nagraj uh, really tried to focus on in his scholarship. And what he was trying to say is, you have all these subaltern humanist refutations of orthodoxy, and the 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 institutionalized ruling elite culture. And it is in these Desi rebellions where we often uh, have ideas of equality and tolerance and pluralism. These are the Desi traditions that we need to rescue and rehabilitate. And he had his thesis, or his project, was to show how colonial amnesia has led to the forgetting of these vibrant pluralistic Desi traditions that contested uh, hegemonic Brahminical ideas. And so that's a very interesting perspective that's not often spoken about these days. You have often one-dimensional views of how society was constructed from above, which are often, theoretical, and how often is it borne out by actual living practices of people, who lived through these times. But these bottom-up cultural pushback, the Desi, uh, you know, response to these uh, hegemonic practices, they actually tell us more about how people were living and what values they had dear. And so, but of course, he recognizes that you can't impose value judgments on either of these. If you start thinking, oh, one is the hero and the other is the villain, then you already sort of lost the plot. Because what he calls the Desi, he also tries to point out that it can be very naive if you keep imagining that you have this great, uh, pure, unblemished cultural ore that you can somehow excavate, and that will dictate your idea of your people's genius and all of this. So that itself can be ahistorical and naive. And this is where I mean, Nagaraj is also trying to critique the new notion of Hindu supremacism, and okay, we have everything in our culture, we figured everything out. So that is really naive sometimes, especially things you see today. And so, but he recognized that the project itself shouldn't be abandoned, but it can, in some sense, be tempered. This quest for self-determination can be tempered by the humility of our plural pasts, and so I think it's a wonderful way of thinking about history. And so I quote him quite often, and he's still very relevant today and very helpful in trying to think about all these things.
Yeah, that was a very well put discussion, regarding that. But what I also wanted to know was, where does one slot someone like a Dr. Rajkumar into this, this kind of
Like I
discourse?
said, I mean, these are tools that help you look at certain ways. So in the 20th century, Rajkumar is undoubtedly the new Marga of uh, Kannada cinema. He's almost like a god surrounded by minor figures clamoring for attention. There is no other figure in Kannada cinema who compares to the popularity, respect that Rajkumar and his family have enjoyed. And so I compare Rajkumar with some of the other you know uh, actors and like Upendra, and who were much more uncensored and freewheeling, and in this sense they can be seen as a Desi counterpart to the Marga that Rajkumar has set out. And so these are again loose ways. Language is ultimately metaphor, and it's only as useful as how interesting you're able to see things as. And within certain contexts, they help us view different figures and how they were reacting to, conceptions of art and elite art, and you know, the notion that art is democratic and anybody should be able to lay claim to it. And that, in some sense, is the heart of the Desi predicament. This is, I have the resources within me to uh, you know, talk, sing, and write, and so on, without the need for anybody supervising or commenting or you know uh, technically judging someone. I don't know if I was clear.
Yeah. That was, yeah. So, as a doctor, one of the things that I noticed also in this comparison was, when you talk about the two hemispheres of the brain, right? And in a nutshell, it was, something like, the left hemisphere is generally involved with solving a problem, or, breaking something down into a simpler format, right? And the right hemisphere is generally involved in, more creative, more creative aspects, right? So, where does one slot this into the larger binary and paradigm of Marga and Desi that you are
I mean, I would
discussing?
still be wary of demarcating it like that. It's That's an older. I mean, the writer I quote, Ian McGilchrist. He's written this book called "The Matter with Things." He has this hemisphere hypothesis, where he recognizes that there is a difference between the two hemispheres,
Yeah,
and
it can't be
but
neatly demarcated, but yeah.
yeah, but it can't be neatly demarcated. Okay, this is art, and this is
Yeah.
rational thinking or whatever. What he says is there's a way in which the hemispheres pay attention to the world. And so he studies stroke patients that have only the left hemisphere intact, the others been completely, immobilized. And through all these cases, what he's arguing for is that left alone, there is a particular form of attention that the left hemisphere pays to the world, where you see things in a piecemeal sort of way. Things are disconnected. There is the sense of the whole is missing. And in extreme cases, if you have only the left hemisphere, it leads to absolute schizophrenia, in the sense someone will show you your left hand, which is what the right hemisphere perceives. But if you have only the left hemisphere, you can't see it. You'll say, no, it's not my hand. It's my mother's hand. It's your friend's hand. It cannot possibly be my hand. So, despite showing the most clinching evidence possible, it refuses to recognize it. And the world is reduced to a sort of 2D figure without the richness that a more complex understanding of the world, entails. So he compares it to this world of screens and two-dimensional engagement with the world kind we're having right now. But what I found interesting was some of what McGilchrist is warning against, the perils of excessive um, going for the kill, ultra rationalist think boy kind of behavior. It's the sort of same language that D.R. Nagaraj uses to talk about the perils of the Desi thing, uh, Desiness or Desivada, as he calls it, which is that you've entered a phase of anxiety. There's not even argument anymore. You're just anxious about some pure, pristine essence that has been, besmirched and defiled or whatever, and you're out to recover this. And this gets into a sort of militant attitude towards all that is cosmopolitan, and you feel that everything is out to attack you. And so, in that sense, uh, I think he had a very interesting insight into the psychology of the Desi rebellion. What is it that compels a political ideology or an ideologue or a thinker or anybody to keep having these notions of glorious, um, you know, unblemished, pure, pristine cultural past that will always be a guideline, whatever you're doing, no matter how different the times are, and so on. So this is where this idea of not seeing what is right in front of you, that kind of mental blocking. So that's where I think these sort of ways, these binaries come together. And so uh, I found it quite uncanny, which is why I included this whole bit of neuroscience and all of that. And
Yeah. I mean, the string sort of, it formed a whole neat thread of discussion throughout, that chapter. And since we, talking about unblemished pasts, that, sort of brings me to my next question, which is, you talk about the Hindu revivalist movement also within your book. And, you note how, in the early aspects of the 20th century, this Hindu revivalist thought was, more benign and, more Gandhian in terms of its outlook, right? I
in
think there were
Karnataka, at
figures like
least.
Pandit Taranath and so on. And, later you contrast that with, what happens later on, with, say, figures like Shatavadani or Ganesh, wherein, he's more vitriolic or more, not
Openly
so, not
bigoted.
so, yeah, when it comes to, certain aspects of, say, demonizing, he's, like a bit blunt with regards to his approach. So, how did these, trajectories gradually, change? Like, how did this, trajectory gradually change, within the Kannada literary world?
I mean, it's again something to do with kind of anxiety of being unable to relate to the past in any other way. It's a failure of uh, the, the right wing intelligentsia, also, I think. So, if you look at the early 20th century, I talk about K.V. Iyer, bodybuilder who's also a novelist. So, he starts this gym in Bangalore called Hercules Gym. And he's writing novels about Michelangelo, but also he's worshipping two enormous images of Ram and Hanuman every weekend at his Vyayam Shala. So these are people who had very cosmopolitan worldview, but they were able to fuse it with very heartfelt revivalist movements. And even Pandit Taranath, for instance, who the big follower of Vivekananda, and but he's also remembered as a big Gandhian who set up this Madrasa-e-Hamdard in Raichur, which aimed at uniting Hindus and Muslims in the freedom struggle. He's also remembered as a staunch opponent of the Nizam rule. So they were able to uh, respond politically without uh, this sort of open bigotry that's become so mainstream right now. And in fact, I don't think what you have today can be called a conservative movement in any way. It's a very radical movement. And I was actually reading some article recently where it felt rare to read an actual conservative voice in India. It was actually uh, calling out this environment for being too radical, too unrooted in actually any aspect of culture or wisdom, traditions, or whatever. All of these things have been jettisoned in favor of this very anxious, very radical, very freewheeling sort of modernity. So I would argue that the present environment around the world, right-wing environments around the world, are not conservative in any sense. If you look at all the most decent people, whether it's Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn, so they're actually uh, trying to do what conservatives in the 20th century were doing, very decent things, standing up against violence, genocide, so on. So that global movement is also happening in India, I think. And so I think we should be careful when we are trying to look at all these ideas through received notions of left and right and conservative and progressive and so on. And oftentimes it's completely flipped. And only if you start looking at the ideas that are being espoused that you see what's actually happening.
Yeah. Okay. Since we're talking about ideologies also, one of the other things you talk about is, the about how in the Kannada literary world, you have this, different kind of worldview regarding Gandhi, right? It's a rather interesting view of Gandhi that one comes across in the Kannada literary world, wherein you see figures like, Prasanna, who, claims to be a Marxist turned Gandhian, and, like, what is it about Gandhi that, sort of appealed to Marxists more than, say like like a Marx or Lenin, within the Kannada imaginaire?
It's, there's a lot to be said here about the influence of Lohia within the Kannada literary political world. Um, so from the 50s onwards, from the Kagodu Satyagraha, 1951, um, there emerges the figure of Gopal Gowda Shantveri, socialist legislator from Shimoga. So these are the Lohiite socialists. The, it's a uh, worldview that really influences a lot of Kannada writers, Anantamurthy, Lankesh, you name it. And they relied on, or they admired Gandhi quite a bit, and especially Gandhi's influence in terms of using literature as as a mode of ethical and political reckoning. And so this rootedness in nonviolence and in some sense being this critical cultural insider uh, keeps them a little distance away from the more radical communists. Uh, the uh, the rejection of tradition is not something the Lohiite socialists take to very easily. That they don't have that kind of relationship. It's a much more uh, intimate, self-critical relationship with tradition. And again, this goes back to earlier influence of Gandhi on Kannada literary also, whether it is Kuvempu or D.B. Gundappa or Alur Venkat Rao. All of these figures admired Gandhi. It had a very uh, remarkable impact on the cultural ethos of Kannada society. And this follows through even to the end of the 20th century. So I interviewed Devnur Mahadeva, for instance. And the first thing he says is he points to a book on his table. It's about the Gandhian um, economist, what's his name? Um, anyway, so he tells us that look, we're people of an older generation. We still have Gandhi in our lives, and this was something I heard from a lot of the old activists. I met people in the 60s, 70s. So this influence of Gandhi, the influence of that kind of moral struggle that Gandhi engaged in, people were able to view it with some kind of sympathy, despite his idealization, despite his stumbles and failures. So I didn't expect to find this, but throughout my interviews across the political spectrum, I heard uh, all manner of solidarity with Gandhi and his ideas. And this is something that uh, I think strikes me as unique to Karnataka. I don't think you can see this in too many parts of this country. This idea of not seeing Gandhi and Ambedkar as antithetical figures, to see them as having their own projects. Of course, they were rivals in their lives, but um, as inheritors of those debates, we don't necessarily have to. And this is what D.R. Nagaraj also tries to do in his essays, where he's trying to keep Gandhi and Ambedkar on the same plane of thought, trying to argue, in the sense, both are arguing for internal uh, reforms within traditions. Ambedkar through his New Buddhism, Gandhi through his reformed Hinduism, to whatever extent that might be successful. And so it's an interesting tradition. And I mean, I just wrote an essay on Kalburgi. It got published today morning. Kalburgi too. I mean, he often compares Basavanna to Gandhi, and in his eyes, they were comparable because they're both reinventing or rejuvenating older moral ethical traditions into newer vocabularies, adapting it to their own political times. And so the more I looked into it, the more I felt that Gandhi's presence was quite pervasive. And I realized it towards the end of the book, actually, when I was just putting the chapters together. It felt so unexpected.
All right, we'll have one last question before we see whether there are any questions from the audience. So let's, end it with Kuempu. Like, the man is undoubtedly an icon, but, like he's, like at the pinnacle of the Kannada literary world. If you, think about a figure today, I think like from a literary perspective, Kuempu would undoubtedly be one of the first names that would come to the mind. But my question is, somewhere isn't like, again, coming back to the aspect of historical amnesia, Kuempu, the socialist, and Kuempu, the humanist, is somewhere, that voice is, lost somewhere, behind this, whole cacophony of, trying to glorify him as, an icon and, not see these deeper aspects to him, what it, like, as he was. Like, even if one looks at, some of the ideas that, covers in his Ramayana Darshanam that you also pointed out, it's this rather, this rejuvenating take, wherein Sita is, asked to go through the Agni Pariksha and, Ram also walks along with her. And also in another work, if I'm not wrong, in Shudra Tapasvi, wherein,
Yeah.
instead of the usual Ramayana episode where Ram, beheads Shambhuka for, breaking the caste order and caste rules, here he, acknowledges him and, respects him for being a great man and being a great soul for what he was. So with that in mind, like one ponders to think, if one were to situate Kuempu in the present day political context and in the current discourse, how would one see him do for himself? How would Kuempu do in today's discourse is my question in a nutshell.
Kuhempu in today's environment would prove to be very problematic for the ruling dispensation, because Kuhempu was a uh, very powerful critic of organized religion. And even though he's remembered, so this particular instance that you spoke of, the Shudra Tapasvi, the reimagining of the Shambhuka episode. So this stems from that Gandhian sensibility of internal reform and of cultural critique while you're firmly planting yourself in it. So he took maybe a decade to write Ramayana Darshanam. It's an extraordinarily huge, complicated work, and so you have to have a great aesthetic sympathy for these cultural traditions to begin with. And one of the reasons he was able to mount all these fierce critiques of organized religion was because he had established himself as an inheritor of these wisdom traditions. And uh, so it's remarkable to think what any of these figures, whether it's Coimbu or Anantamurthy or Gopal Krishna Adika, how they would have fared had they been writing at their peak during the current political moment. And so I was talking to Dr. Rajendra Chenny about Gopal Krishna Adiga, the poet who contests from the Janasangh in 1972. And he said, look, if Adiga had lived past the 90s, he would have been booked for sedition today. And that might be true for a lot of these writers, I think.
Yeah. Okay, that was very well put actually, and I wish we could have extended this a bit further, but we are running out of time as of now. And like if anyone is interested in, like with questions for Shikhar or for us, you can, like directly forward them on to him, and we would be glad to, like carry this forward outside. But for now, on this note, we will end the conversation today. Thank you very much for being a part of this conversation, Shikhar. It was, a delight, and I hope we can, do this again sometime and hopefully offline as we promised.
Thanks for reading the book and for all the questions. I hope it was interesting enough.
Yeah. So thank you very much.